Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, an iTutor production. At iTutor, our vision is to ensure every child has access to education, regardless of circumstance. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space, who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Haley Spirabauer. Welcome back, everybody, to today's episode of the Learning Can't Wait podcast. We have an amazing group of individuals here today to talk about the topic fractured learning, the need for cohesion in education. Let me start by introducing our very first guest, Dr. Leo Bialis-White, a partner at New Schools Venture Fund. Leo, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, so glad to be here.
So glad you're here and incredibly grateful that you've introduced me to the next three guests that we have coming. We have Shelby Hildreth, the Director of Program Design from the Academy for Urban School Leadership on the Liberated Way team. Welcome, Shelby.
Hi, everyone.
We have Ulric Shannon, the Director of Purpose at the AUSL, same Academy for Urban School Leadership on the Liberated Way team. Welcome, Ulric.
Happy to be here.
So incredibly grateful you're here today, too. And finally, last but not least, we have Molly Legere, the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives on the Liberated Way team. Molly, welcome.
Hi, excited to be here.
I'm really grateful, as I said. I've been practicing a lot of gratitude. We're just coming off a holiday that's known for gratitude and thankfulness. So grateful that you all took time out of your schedules to be here. I know it's hard to coordinate so many people, especially from the Liberated Way team, who often are feet on the ground, visiting schools, being part of the community. I know it's a challenging role to find yourself sitting down in front of a commuter for a whole hour of time. So thanks for making that time. Why don't you start us off, Shelby, and tell us who is the Liberated Way team and why are you constantly in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Liberated Way team is a part of AUSL, or the Academy of Urban School Leadership. And AUSL has been a school management organization working in partnership with Chicago Public Schools for the past 20 plus years. We also operate one of the longest running teacher residencies in the country. And through the work of managing schools and training novice teachers, AUSL as an organization has learned a lot about what it means to kind of operate schools and schools in high needs areas. And so our team is really the consulting arm of the organization that really tries to take and distill all of those different pieces of learning and support other schools and districts across the country in thinking about how they really transform their schools in service of community. And really at the core of our work is how do we ensure that we're attending holistically to the needs of students, right? Like not just academics, which are super important, but also how are you growing in your social emotional skills? How are you being exposed to different pathways? And really thinking about what's the community's role, right? Like thinking about the entire school community, but the community at large around what it is that we want for the students that go into our schools. And I think that's the learning that we as an organization have had in operating schools, especially in a turnaround space, is who's at the table, whose voices are really being heard. And so we really try to seek to hold space for all of those different people to really act as the leaders that they are in partnership and working towards really strong and equitable outcomes for students in schools.
You're setting the stage perfectly. Speaking of being at the table, setting the table perfectly for our conversation around cohesion, which is the opposite of fractured learning. Obviously, there's a lot of stakeholders, and I'm excited to dig into that in just a few moments. Leo, how did you at New Schools Venture Fund come to know Liberated Way team and the work that they're doing, and why have you all taken such a keen interest in this team's efforts?
Yeah, well, this is the fun part, is getting to watch Shelby, Ulric, and Molly work on the ground and bring some of their learnings to New Schools. Before we jump in, I'll just share that New Schools, we're a national nonprofit. We find, fund, and support teams of educators and innovators who are reimagining public education so that every student finishes high school prepared and inspired to create a good life. And the main way we do that is by working with organizations like Liberated Way. I think the idea of a whole school model and one that thinks about the entire student experience is something that we saw as a real need in the field. And for me personally, the elementary school I went to, my mother was the assistant principal. And so she was able to create an experience for me that really worked for me. But obviously, that's not the reality for most kids, and particularly low-income students and students of color. We are not designing schools for a coherent experience. And so that's why I was so excited to elevate Liberated Way's work and also continue to work with them.
I really love the way you shared part of the mission and the work is that you're investing and you're creating and helping grow organizations and giving a platform to educations that are helping students be prepared and inspired to have a good life. I think that is such a beautiful, beautiful kind of goal to reach towards and something to unify, speaking of coherence, unify your team in an effort to make the world better for deserving students. So thank you for sharing that. So there's a lot here, right? Let's step us back a minute just to talk about this idea of fractured learning. When we say the student learning experience is fractured, what exactly do we mean? Leo, I'm going to kick it off with you to start us, and then we'll dive maybe into a micro level and talk about what we're seeing and feeling and hearing within schools from the Liberated Way team.
Yeah, I'd love to, share the high level view, but really have the Liberated team make it real for the listeners. I think about this on a few different levels. When a child is in a school that day, they go from class to class, in school activities, after school activities, and oftentimes across those transitions, they're getting different messages, different signals, and jagged experiences that don't flow together to a holistic gestalt experience. If we keep thinking beyond the day and we think about from grade level to grade level or institution to institution, the edges are equally jagged. The students are getting different signals, different experiences that don't work towards a unified experience or a unified goal for a self-determined life and increased life chances. And so we know that there are a lot of point solutions out there, but we think that there are schools who may benefit from organizations that can help think across the different elements of school and create cohesion across them. And again, as Shelby talked about, Liberated Way takes that holistic view of students. They work with the school community to make sure that all those touch points are aligned, and that's what got us so excited. So I won't steal their thunder. I'll let them sort of speak more deeply about what they do.
Yeah, that's a perfect kind of baton pass to one of the members of the Liberated Way team. So we talked about the 30,000 foot. Now let's hear from, boots on the ground in schools, building schools, consulting with schools. What does it mean to have a fractured student learning experience from your vantage point?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think one starts with my own personal experience with education, where the development and passion for this work has started from attending a public school, not being seen, not being heard, not being understood, even as a young child, being pushed on being ready for the test. And that's what's going to tell you if you're incredibly smart and prepared for the world. When I knew that I was like, I'm pretty smart, but I'm just a really bad test taker, or maybe it's the test and not me. So when I think about what it means, at the ground level of a fractured learning experience, it is one, the lack of relevancy for schools and connection to students. You would be surprised at how often we may shadow a student and see a kid the entire day who is not asked a question, who does not have to respond to anything. As long as they sit there and they're quiet and they're there on time, maybe with their laptop open and a pen in hand, it is like the educational experience is happening. And is that the true experience that a student would want to feel every single day? It can be a pretty boring day. We also know that we often underestimate the abilities of students. We see there's lack of rigor in a lot of classrooms because we know the work. It makes me feel good as a teacher when I'm able to give good grades. It makes a student feel really good when they get good grades. And every parent wants to post their report card on Facebook. But we know that our students have so much more potential and probably way smarter than many of us. If we put the rigor and the challenge in front of them, they'll problem solve. But I think it starts with the belief of students. So when I think about that fractured system, again, it was designed in a certain way and it is operating as it is. But I think it is now the time more important and more relevant than ever for us to really push that, to understand that the system is operating as it's supposed to. And now it's time for us to change it. There's not one single principal, superintendent, or classroom teacher who's going to change that. It's going to take the coherence and collaboration of community, parents, teachers, school leaders, business leaders to really reimagine what that student experience should be every single day so that every student has the opportunity to be successful in school and not just rely on one curriculum or one test or one adult in front.
I appreciate about your response many things, Ulric. First of all, thanks for being candid and being vulnerable and sharing a little bit about your own school experience. I know when people relate schooling to their own experience, it can be really powerful in helping us decide where we go as a society, but then also calling out the systemic in kind of infrastructure of schools today and how that may have led us here. Molly, I'm curious from your perspective, what hurdles teachers face as a result of this fractured point solution model? We named a little bit about the students, but how about the teachers? How does this impact them?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. It is something I think about often as a former teacher and as someone who's studied teachers and now in this role really works to support teachers. I think we're asking teachers to transform the student experience in an ecosystem that was not built for that transformation. And, we've all heard those kind of pithy statements like, the system is designed exactly for the outcomes it achieves, which I agree with. And I think those statements actually hide the immensity of the challenges that teachers face as those who are often positioned as the frontline workers of transformation. And so ultimately, when we talk about school transformation, we are often asking teachers to change their practices, their mindsets, their routines, amidst a district and school and even state infrastructure that makes that super, super difficult. And it's for this reason that the Liberated Way team so often works to bring in district leadership and school leadership so that those who are leading transformation represent the voice of the community, but also that they're not in this alone. It is so hard to be a teacher right now. There is fear about the workplace, there is loneliness, there's isolation, there's frustration. And if we're taking care of teachers who are going to be taking care of kids, we have to position them to make sure that they are not in charge of transforming a system that is not set up for that kind of transformation.
Teachers are absolutely on the front lines there, Molly. I think you called that out very in an apropos manner. Leo, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, when we did a little bit of a step back of like, who's talking about coherence and cohesion at schools? And there is a lot of dialogue about instructional coherence. Like, does the curriculum map to the pedagogy? Does it map to the assessment? And I think that is obviously a place we want to start. And we do want folks to sort of learn about what they're going to be assessed on. There should be continuity. But I think what I've learned a lot from the Liberated Way is it's beyond just instructional coherence, that so much of this community buy-in is about the messages that they're getting in after school activities, in different venue, in the hallway. And if everyone's not using an asset-based voice, for example, students aren't going to get that consistent experience and aren't going to feel that fully. And so I think we need to expand the conversation beyond instructional coherence to a broader definition of coherence.
And Shelby, you started us off with that, right? You talked a lot about the different voices, having everybody have stake at the table or a seat at the table. When you hear Leo share that, obviously this resonates deep with you. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about achieving that outcome of having everybody being able to contribute to the conversation and build the school from the community level?
I think a couple of things that I would share, like Leo, I really appreciate your point around like it's everybody, right? Like from the cafeteria workers to wherever. And I think, one of the things that we really try to do in our work is expand sort of the definition of what we mean when we say leader, right? A lot of times when we say leader, we're talking specifically about the school principal or the leadership team, right? Like assistant principals. But really, when we think about leadership, it's really everybody, and everybody kind of having a role in being able to sort of support overall vision, but really give feedback about whether or not what we're attempting to do is actually working for the folks that, you know, we're really trying to serve. And so one of the ways that we approach this is we really spend a lot of time at the very beginning thinking about what do we want for the students in this particular context? And we try to bring everybody to the table to be a part of that conversation in some form. So in our partnerships, we form design teams. And so on those design teams, we really seek to find a representative group of folks within a particular school or district context to be a part of designing what our graduate portrait, right? Like, which really becomes our North Star. And I know it's kind of like cliche, but I don't know what else to call it, but becoming the North Star in our particular content, or particular context. And so we bring this really diverse group of folks together that both sort of share in a collective learning and collective design, but also work to really build empathy about the experience of folks, of students in schools, of parents in schools. And so, for instance, one of the very first things that we have our design team members do is actually find students and parents and the folks that experience our leadership and have conversations with them, do an empathy interview to learn more about their experience. So as we're starting to develop what our graduate portrait is going to be, right, across our academic skills and pathways and social emotional leadership, we're doing that in a way where folks now have firsthand experience or firsthand knowledge of what the experience of a student or a community member or a teacher member of that community is. And I think for a lot of our participants, that really is very eye-opening. So a lot of things you assume that you know, but really actually going to talk to people and hearing from them actually makes a big difference. One just like quick anecdotal example of this is we're working with a district that we've been working with for a long time to develop a graduate portrait. And we brought their district leadership team together as a part of this process. And what was really interesting, and like in that district leadership team, you've got folks that worry about finance and transportation. And so there's a little bit of everybody, but that was their first activity, was doing empathy interviews with folks, with members of the school and district community. And when they brought their findings back, I think it was really eye-opening for several people, especially those that are farther removed from the regular sort of day-to-day school. And I just remember one of the reflections being like, if I don't make this decision right now, it has a lot of downstream effects for schools and people that I may never see. And so like really getting them to understand that like even decisions at central office, there is a direct line to students around what that looks like. And so being really intentional at all levels and really working to build capacity and move at all levels by designing this graduate portrait together and then starting to think about what are all the various levels of leadership that we're going to have to leverage to move towards our North Star. At the same time, it's not just teachers, it's not just school leaders, but it's really everybody working in concert together. And so that's really what we seek to hold space for with our partners is bringing all of those voices to the table.
And I think there's a couple of innovations there that are a little or subtle, but really, really important. So I think if you surveyed all schools that they have sort of a vision for a graduate, a lot of people would say yes, but I think that they like live in a file folder somewhere. And I think what Liberated Way really does is make it live and lasting and community based. And so I think we should not undersell the importance of not just creating a graduate portrait, but making it living. The second thing is, I think similarly, if you ask students feedback, there's a difference between asking kids about like what kind of food they want in the cafeteria versus like how do their experiences flow together and build on each other towards that graduate portrait. So I think some of the most critical innovations that Liberated Way is upholding are both the like getting something off of a piece of paper and getting it to live, and also asking students really deep questions about how supports are woven together and not just what's your favorite thing, when should the school dance be?
Yeah. And then one other thing that I'll add to that as well, Leo, is just that the other thing that we really try to do is once we have the portrait for students is starting to think about, okay, well, if that's what we want for students and what are the specific behaviors or practices that we would want to see teachers do that will create those types of experiences. And so being able to outline that piece as well, and then taking that all the way up to, okay, then as a school leader, what does that mean in terms of my own leadership about how I support teachers to create those types of experiences? You back that all the way up to the district. What does that mean in terms of district operations? And so as we get the graduate portrait, really thinking about what are those tangible things that need to happen across the entire system so that we're all having this conversation. It's really interesting to do this process as a district because with districts, because it really becomes super comprehensive and kind of all encompassing. The anecdote that I just gave, there's one high school in that district. And so what we're able to do is think about this from like the elementary school level to the middle school level to the high school level and eventually off into sort of post-secondary. And it's been really, really important to have all of those people at the table across those different grade bands, because what we're finding in conversations is that elementary school teachers didn't realize what they needed, what students need when they get to middle school, and middle school teachers didn't know that's, and so being able to have those types of conversations across and amongst an entire community has been really important. I mean, the trade-off is it takes longer at the front end to be able to design in that way because people's schedules and there's a lot of iteration, but like that type of iteration and work really, really pays off in the long run because you're able to create more coherence across the entire system as opposed to pulling one lever and not others when you really kind of have to pull them in concert together.
Oh my goodness, Shelby, so much goodness in there. I love your backward design kind of vantage point about the whole child. Again, we're not just talking right now on the podcast about academic solutions. We're talking about all the components, all of the profile for the graduates in your community. And then you kind of hit the nail on the head with what I was thinking. As I was listening to you, I was like, I bet some folks are hearing this and they're like, yeah, that's going to take a lot of time. But it feels to me like a slow down to speed up process that allows for maybe not speed, but what we're aiming for on this conversation, which is coherence.
Yes, I would agree with all of that. And like, it really is a slowdown. And like, that's why a lot of those documents or those different plans kind of fall by the wayside because we move too quickly. We don't get enough buy-in and investment. And like, we really work hard to make sure that we've got as much investment as possible because it's going to take everybody to move this entire system within an individual school or within an entire district as well.
I'm sorry, I was just going to add, the funny thing is, as you talk about speed and how fast we're moving, in the same way that we're moving extremely fast and making quick decisions and doing the things to students and to families, school still looks the same as it has at 150 years. I mean, we may have Chromebooks and some smart boards, but the experience is pretty much the same for my grandmother, who was a school teacher, from the time I was a student to the time I was in the classroom and the classrooms I visit today. So like, what is the real impactful change when it comes to speed? When we probably need to slow down and evaluate the entity as a whole to really create a new experience of what school. And I believe if we don't do it as educators and leaders in this space alongside with those students, someone else is going to step into this space and redesign it for us.
Absolutely. This is a critical time. And, it leads me to my next question, which is really, I'm wondering from your vantage points, both Leo from yours, from the funding community, and Molly, Shelby, and Ulric from yours in the nonprofit space and in building schools and in innovating schools. How has the pandemic accelerated innovation? Obviously, to your point, Ulric, we're not at transformation quite yet, but how has the pandemic accelerated, decelerated, changed education as we know it?
Yeah, I can share a couple of thoughts sort of sector-wide. I mean, first off, it goes without saying, but schools, districts, and states got $190 billion from the federal government with, fewer restrictions than they ever have. Nonprofits, like AUSL and Liberated Way got none of that. And so these school districts are at capacity, they're very low on bandwidth. They're having to fill vacant roles, dealing with emergent issues, while also expecting to use this money for transformative change. And so I do think there's like an interesting dynamic where nonprofits like Liberated Way have a ton to offer, but they didn't get any of that federal money. And so can they get connected with the right schools to bring those solutions in and be patient? I think a second thing is the funding community also has a role to sort of step up and support these types of organizations with patient capital so that these innovations can be implemented with fidelity and be patient and making sure that they can serve all students. I think the last thing I'll say on the ESSER front is like 65% of school districts have added after school activities with academic interventions. There's still over $100 billion to be spent. And how all those things weave together are going to be really critical. So if you have a tier 1 core ELA curriculum, how does that map onto the literacy work that's happening after school or the tutoring work that's happening before school and remotely? And so those types of connections, I think, are actually really, really important and shouldn't be overlooked. So it's not just about adding things, but how are they woven together?
I think there is a puzzle that we're putting together right now in real time. And it is somewhat of an experiment now that there are, for the next couple of years at least, an increase of available funds. So I'm glad you named that. I know a lot of schools today are experimenting with supplemental learning, but also with there was a recent Brookings report about instructional time and expanding the school day and the advantages to doing that across the board. These are real decisions that leaders have to make as they come into the second half of the school year that will dramatically impact students, both social and emotionally and academically. So appreciate you naming that, Leo. So Liberated Way folks, same question, different bit of a bend, but how has the pandemic changed what you see in schools, in and around schools right now? And are you experiencing or are you benefiting from some of the increase in available resources, or are you still facing challenges in implementing solutions that you find to be beneficial for students?
I think so. Yes, we benefited, right? Like we benefited from, some of the extra funding that is changing now. So the landscape, I think, is a little bit different. I think what we experienced though is there are a lot of new solutions, and I think new solutions are great. Innovation is great. And I would say there's probably in some instances, some oversaturation of solutions. And so it's hard for schools and districts to sometimes prioritize things that are going to stick, right? And I think, one of the things that's like really helpful about our process is it allows us to not only develop a new graduate portrait, right, in service of community and holistic, child development, but really think about like, how do we make decisions differently as a cohesive group of people? And so our hope is that we're able to arm our partners with new approaches for making decisions so that when we choose a solution, or if we choose a new curricular material, or we choose a new partnership, it really is in service of our vision. I think in the middle of the pandemic and probably immediately after that, there was a lot of like, we've got a lot of money to spend, so we're just going to spend it. But it wasn't necessarily in a way that was coherent, to use that word again, that really going to push student outcomes. And so I think the hope now is that we're able to sort of like support our partners in thinking a little bit more strategically about how to deploy those resources in a way that makes sense for their particular school or district.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Molly, let's talk about those tools for a second, right? We know there was a report late last year from Learn Platform that individual students were using 75 tools accessed during the pandemic, and teachers were at 86 tools. We know that the increase of tools has led to some questions about data interoperability. Talk to our listeners about the increase in tools over the pandemic and what you think is the best step forward for using those tools in a coherent fashion.
Yeah, Ulric, Shelby, and I, we see this a lot in our work with districts, especially those bigger districts. And I think this conversation on tool use, it has to be disciplined a little bit. I think there's something to be said that there are many tools, and what we really care about is the coherence of those tools to the task and to the North Star that task is supposed to move us closer to. And I'm not super good with metaphors, but I'm gonna try my best here. I think when building a house, there's no single tool. Actually, there's a large number of tools, but they each have a purpose and they're utilized by people who've been trained, well, we hope, to use those tools. And in that way, the number of tools and how they're used is really disciplined by a couple of things, right? We've got the purpose of that operation, be it building a house or improving teaching and learning. And we don't expect everyone to be able to use each tool. But if you're charged with using a tool, be it an app or some kind of instructional tool, we expect that you know how to wield it as part of this kind of complex operation. So I think all of that to say is, in our large districts, what we've seen is that there are a vast number of tools, and that these tools have been adopted over time for curriculum, for data, for assessment, for family and community engagement. But there just hasn't really been an analysis of whether or not that tool is high quality given the North Star. And that's a thing that I think is super important, that when we think about the number of tool use and how that's created confusion, exhaustion, and really disjointed efforts, we can probably boil that back down to a bunch of decisions that were made pretty high up the ladder of command that ultimately were not made by situating the North Star front and centered. I am a big believer, and I think we've seen in our work, that people want to feel like they are part of a well-oiled team. They want to know that they have an impact in their role and that impact has fed into a larger impact of their team. And when you have just too many tools that aren't disciplined by how appropriate they are for a shared community vision, and they aren't accompanied by training, we just aren't setting up our folks to go off and thrive as part of a team. Some of the things that the Liberated Way team has done to kind of step back and combat this increase in tool use is to start with the vision and then to do a bit of an audit to think about what the most essential tools are and what tools can be treated as kind of the fat that can be skimmed off or which have to be adapted to get us closer to the vision. And I think that step back and those kind of audits just don't happen as frequently as possible because there isn't a really compelling vision that's community centered. And folks lack so much capacity that those kind of step backs often get pushed to the side to make room to put out some fires.
I love that, Molly. And I think one point I want to make is that in the absence of that coordination, who's going to lose out? It's the kids whose parents have parents who are working multiple jobs, and it's the parents, like the kids whose parents aren't able to volunteer every day in the school and make those connections and understand the difference between Lexia and iReady and all of those different tools. And so this is not just a writ large issue. This is an equity issue because the kids with privilege and resources are going to find ways to triangulate 75 tools. The kids who don't have that same access are going to be left to figure out and make coherence on their own.
I really appreciate that, Leo. It is an equity issue and we should start naming it as such.
I think something else that I wanted to raise, and I'd be interested to hear, Liberated Way, your thoughts on this is, I don't want to conflate coherence and cohesion with a single experience for every kid, because I don't think that's what we're talking about. A coherent school system can have differentiation, can have response to intervention and MTSS. But I'm interested to know how you all think about that, like the difference between a cohesive experience for all students, but not saying that every student has to get the same thing.
Yeah, I really, really love that distinction, Leo, because I think a cohesive experience actually requires some differentiation, right? Like as we think about introducing students to new pathways, right? To new pathways to really find out what sparks their interest. Well, that's going to look different for every student. And so what should be coherent in that part of the experience is giving students exposure to multiple opportunities to explore various pathways through partnerships in community or with institutes of higher ed or bringing in different, right? Like there's lots of ways that you can do that. So the thing that is the same is the process of that exploration, but where that exploration takes any individual student is going to look a little bit different because all kids are different. And so like being able to kind of respond to that, I think is really important in the work that we do. I think the other thing that's really important in our work is, once you have a portrait, a really strong portrait of the outcomes and the skills and dispositions that we want students to walk away from our schooling with, every teacher is going to approach that a little bit different. I talk with my team a lot about it's outcome, not necessarily process, right? And so like, how do we allow for getting to the same outcome in various ways? Because that's where you get really great innovation. You don't get innovation by making everybody do the same thing the exact same way. And so how do we really leverage sort of a really strong picture? I think in a lot of ways, like having that really strong North Star actually is probably more liberating for teachers and for school leaders, because what we're focused on is, are we getting the outcomes as opposed to, did you follow this specific process? That is a gigantic mindset shift. It takes a lot of time to get there, and everybody kind of goes on that journey a little bit differently. But I think ultimately that's where we're trying to support our partners in getting to, is focusing much more on those outcomes. And that allows for some really smart differentiation, both in the student experience, but also in the teacher experience and in the experience for parents, right? There has to be some sort of differentiation along the way to get the people at the table that you need to be able to move students in the way that communities want them to move.
I have to tell you right now, I have chills. I'm also on your website, which is liberatedway.org, looking up your partner schools, thinking, when am I next in one of these towns to visit and see some of this in action? As someone who hasn't been in a school as a leader or a teacher for nearly 6 years now, this is what I wanted. This is like the piece that was missing, the backward design, the identifying the problems and their roots, bringing the right people to the table. It is such a breath of fresh air to hear how this team is so committed to ensuring that learning is right for each and every child. There's no one size fits all solution, and that everybody needs a voice at the table. One of my questions that I had told you all that I might ask in advance was, where do you see glimmers in the future? Like, what's your hope for the future? And for me, I'm not trying to center myself, but I have to say, like, your work is what my hope is for the future. Like what you are doing in schools today, how you're sharing your vision and what you're doing to help communities build is really incredibly heartening after a lot of years of just trouble in schools and difficulty and challenges. So I want to say thank you as I'm listening to you for sharing just the efforts that you're making. And Leo, really to you for introducing me to this team.
No, we appreciate it. We're excited about the work too. We're excited about where it's going and all of the things that we're learning. It's been a great experience so far. We're excited for where we're going.
Yeah, the thing that inspires me most is right now in too many schools, we don't ask students how their experience is jagged or coherent. And then on the back end, we expect them to create the coherence. The onus is all on them. And Liberated Way is flipping that. They are asking the students, how is your experience coherent and how can we make it more coherent? They're asking the whole community, and then they are putting the onus on the community to do that work on behalf of the students. And that's the bright spot that I'm so excited about.
So I don't want to end the conversation. I don't. But I also know that as incredible community leaders, y'all have places to go and people to see and things to do. So I want to wrap us up with one question that each of you will answer, which is, what is your greatest hope for schools over the next school year? So we're recording right now at the end of 2022. So let's talk about 2023 and 2024. So I'll start with you, Ulric. What is your greatest hope for schools over the next school year?
Wow, that is a really big question. I'll answer it based off of my own professional journey, personal journey. that I hope to see is that where families and communities are true partners in the student experience. I think every school wants to be known for something special and what makes them special. But I'm really excited to see the increase in parent engagement across schools post-pandemic, because school came home and parents got to see it. And now they have a different way or purpose for advocating for their own students. So I'm looking forward over the next school year to see more families, more communities really engage in that process of creating each school in every community to be elite in its own very special and unique way.
Incredible. Ulric, I'm going backward through the alphabet. So next up we have Shelby.
Yeah, I would say, in the next year, oh gosh, it's a really great question. And I think one of the hopes that I would have in that is that we really, really rethink the function that school serves, but B, how we really center sort of like everyone's humanity in this work. I think one of the things that gets lost, but I get really excited about in terms of our process, is that all of these are people. And people have their own stuff that they're bringing to this work. And so not only how do we improve the experience for students, but how do we improve the experience for teachers, right? How do we improve the experience for leadership? We know that people are leaving. And so we're leaving the profession. And so how do we really rethink how the system works? I think we're going to be forced to learn some new lessons in the next year or so. And so my hope would be that we're really starting the process of responding to those learnings in a way that really attends to the humanity of everybody that interacts with the educational system.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Shelby. Molly, how about you?
Ultimately, like my colleagues, I want all students to have opportunities to engage in liberated learning every single day. That said, I am a realist, and I know that's a transformational goal that's going to take far more than a year to accomplish. And so I hope over the next school year that we begin to take note of what we're learning from research on schools. Teachers are leaving en masse, students are disengaged, parents are angry and feel disenfranchised. And I think that the first step in change is recognizing the issue and beginning to understand why that is. And so given that, over this next year, I hope that we as a collective begin to harvest the wisdom of a very broad base of school community stakeholders, including teachers, students, and families, to better understand the challenge and how to move forward to fix it. That's different, right? We're used to excluding these stakeholders, but I think that we need to start to build a true community in understanding this problem before we can go off and expect transformation to happen.
We are creating quite the call to action right now with these final answers from everybody. Molly, thank you for sharing yours as well. A very powerful and profound statement. And Leo, last but not least.
Yeah, well, I have to pick my head up after writing everything that was just said down for my own future reference. The wonky answer is I want to see us align time, people, money, and strategy around coherence and stop thinking about sort of point solutions and think about the overall student experience. But that translates to, can you walk up to a student at school and say, do you feel seen? Do you feel heard? Are people helping you get where you want to go in life? And is everyone rowing in the same direction? Can you ask a student that? And no matter what zip code they live in, no matter what the color of their skin is, can they say yes? With real enthusiasm. That's the future that I want to see.
So similarly, important call to action for those folks listening in. We have all kinds of stakeholders in the education space that listen into these podcasts, but if you take nothing else away from today's episode, this last question really was profound and did a lot to encapsulate the work of both New Schools Venture Fund and the Liberated Way team. Ulric, Shelby, Molly, and Leo, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Haley.
And for those of you tuning in, thanks for joining, and tune in again next time. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you liked what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@itutor.com.
Your campus needs teachers now, and we've got you covered. With over 1,500 state-certified educators from across the U.S. ready to serve both your part-time and full-time requirements, iTutor is perfectly poised to virtually meet all your academic needs with live educators in and around school hours. Learn how today at itutor.com.